Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Welcome to Mount Vernon. I'm glad it seems like the weather is cooperating now, so I think we're in much better shape. I want to welcome all of you here that are here in the theater and also all of you who are watching around the world through our virtual format. My name is Jim Ambuske. I direct the Center for Digital History here at the Washington Library. I want to thank you all for joining us here this evening, wherever you are, and I particularly want to thank the Ford Motor Company Fund for sponsoring tonight's Ford Evening Book Talk. They are very generous in their support, and they make this program possible, and we thank them very much. Tonight, we are very fortunate to spend an evening with Dr. Julie Flavell, who I will introduce in just a moment, but just a few housekeeping items before we start tonight's main event. I do want to let you know that we have two exciting programs coming up here at Mount Vernon in the coming weeks. On June 3rd through the 5th, we'll be hosting the 2022 Mount Vernon Symposium. This is a 3-day event that will feature leading gardeners, historians, horticulturalists, archaeologists, and preservationists as they reconsider the importance of gardening, landscapes, and design in early America. The in-person symposium is sold out, but virtual tickets are available, and I encourage you to purchase yours today. And then on the 23rd of June, we're doing something in partnership with the Old Presbyterian Meeting House in Alexandria, who are celebrating their 250th anniversary in 2022, which is very exciting. We'll be welcoming authors Ellen Hamilton and David O. Stewart here to Mount Vernon to talk about their new books and to talk about Scotland and Revolutionary America and the many connections between those two places in that period. This will be a hybrid event, so you're welcome to join us here at Mount Vernon and also virtually as well. And you can find tickets for both events by going to mountvernon.org and looking at the calendar feature there on the main homepage. Now, it does give me indeed great pleasure to introduce to you tonight's featured speaker. Dr. Julie Flavell is a historian of the American Revolution who took her PhD at the University of College London. She is originally from the United States, but now she resides in one of my favorite places, Scotland, in Dundee in particular, and she has taught American history at universities in Dundee and Edinburgh. She is the previous author of a very important book called When London Was Capital of America. It wasn't always Washington, D.C. At one point, it was in fact London. But she's here tonight to talk to us about her marvelous new book, really engaging piece of work, The Howe Dynasty, the untold story of a military family and the women behind Britain's wars for America, which I should note is a finalist for the 2022 George Washington Prize. Dr. Flavell will offer us a short presentation followed by a brief chat with me, but then much more importantly, questions from you here in the audience at Mount Vernon and coming to us from around the world. So please do join me in giving Dr. Julie Flavell a warm Mount Vernon welcome.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Right. Okay. Well, today I'm going to start with a question that I'm often asked at the end of my talks, which is, how did I become interested in the house? And the fact is that there isn't an easy answer to this because my interest in the house is longstanding and it's evolved over many years. I grew up in the Boston area where, of course, local stories about the American Revolution abound. That's where I got my interest in the subject. And I was always intrigued by the figure of General William Howe. He seemed to me like somebody with an unexplored backstory. He was the redcoat general who, if the stories are true, was so well liked when he arrived in Boston in May 1775 that American sharpshooters desisted from firing at him from behind the rebel barricades when they recognized him on Bunker Hill. And by 1776, in what was an unusual arrangement, he was commander-in-chief of the British forces in America alongside of his brother, Admiral Lord Howe. And the impression that the Howe command was a family affair is intensified by the fact that the brothers, as Admiral and General Howe were called during the War of Independence, had another brother who they had lost 20 years earlier in the American wilderness fighting the French at Fort Ticonderoga. So neither Admiral nor General Howe had the usual profile of British career officers jumping into the American war hoping to get ahead. So when I came to study the American Revolution as a serious scholar, I discovered that the sense of mystery that I detected about the Howes was a persistent thread in every work, scholarly work on the Howe command. For over 2 centuries, there have been longstanding conspiracy theories surrounding the brothers to the effect that they were deliberately soft on the rebellion. And these theories have been taken seriously over the years by historians, and they've never entirely died down. Now, the fact is that the Howes they normally in histories, they're given the greatest share of the blame for Britain's failure to win the war, because their command was at a time when France hadn't come in on the side of the Americans, and the American army wasn't quite yet up to professional scratch. And of course, the British expected the war to be an easy victory. So like any commanders in any war who failed in their objective, they've been accused of all sorts of missed opportunities. But they've also been accused of what's much worse, which is deliberate failure to bring the war to a conclusion by avoiding an all-out confrontation with the rebel army. And all sorts of motives have been adduced to account for this backwardness in the service of their country. And the sense of mystery around the Howes, the words mysterious and enigmatic are frequently applied to them, was compounded by an accidental fire that destroyed all of the Howe family papers a few decades after the war. So historians have stressed that virtually nothing is known about the private lives and the family lives of the Admiral or General Howe beyond what can be found in professional papers, military dispatches. So the Howes seemed like a closed book, but I was led back to them through a very unexpected route. I was thinking of writing a sequel to my book, When London Was Capital of America. And in quest of material, I went to the letters of Caroline Howe. She was the sister of the Admiral and the General. And her letters are in the Spencer papers in the British Library. For over 40 years, she had a very close correspondence with a woman who was her closest friend, Lady Georgiana Spencer, the mother of the famous Duchess of Devonshire. And Caroline Howe left what was effectively a treasure trove of Howe family letters. And there's no doubt, I mean, in the letters were all sorts of information about her family, her brothers, and so on. And there's no doubt that these letters, which are part of a well-known collection in the British Library, would never, ever have been neglected if they'd been written by a brother of the Admiral and the General instead of a sister. So I decided to write a biography of the Howe Dynasty, the first ever. So today, instead of summing up my book in the time I have, I'm going to introduce 3 women who came alive through my research. And I'm going to introduce portraits from Earl Howe's private collection, some of which are extremely rare. And in the process, I'm going to show how much is lost when biographies of professional men ignore their families and ignore their private lives, because a lot of what was misunderstood about the brothers becomes clear in the context of their family. And I'm going to start with 2 Howe women who were well known in their day, but largely forgotten today. Okay, this is Charlotte Viscountess Howe, and she was the mother of the generation that included the Admiral and the General. And it was her ambition that turned the Howes into a celebrated military family in the 18th century. She was born in 1703 in Hanover, so she was initially German-speaking, and she had royal blood. Her mother, Sophia von Kielmansegg, was the illegitimate half-sister of George I. Sounds confusing, but she was effectively the niece through an illegitimate line of King George I. And she came to England in 1714 with her family when George I ascended the throne of Great Britain. And this is her wedding portrait. She was married just a few years later when she was just 16 to Scrope, 2nd Viscount Howe from Nottinghamshire. Now, I don't think this was an arranged marriage, because Scrope Howe actually wasn't a great catch for somebody with royal blood. His family were relatively poor for aristocrats, and his title was an Irish title, and that means he didn't have a seat in the House of Lords. So if he wanted to be in government, he had to get elected to Parliament. And he was also only 20 when they were married, so it has all the hallmarks of a love match. But after 16 years of marriage, Scrope died, and he left Charlotte with huge debts and with 8 children, aged 13 down to a babe in arms. And so the Howe dynastic fortunes were in dire straits. A lot of this occurred because of the expense of parliamentary elections at the time. The Howe boys were too young to take up any government posts. Usually the resort of aristocratic families that fell on hard times was to find a well-paying post for one of their sons, but all the boys were still in school. So they were actually pulled out of Eton to save on school fees. And for some years, Charlotte and her children lived in the homes of various relatives. And things only changed for her when she got the only paying position that was thinkable for a woman of her rank in those days. And in 1743, she became lady-in-waiting to Princess Augusta. Augusta was the mother of the future King George III. When Charlotte joined Augusta's household, George was a 5-year-old prince. And since Augusta also spoke German, and Charlotte understood the court manners of both Germany and Britain, she was perfect for the post. Now, this job, it sounds very grand, but it didn't actually pay that well. And a lot of the money had to be spent on the expensive court dress that was an absolute requirement. It was almost a uniform. So she was required to wear expensive fabrics, satins, silks, and so on, gold buttons, all sorts of accessories, gold lace. The real value of the post was that it put Charlotte in a position to find suitable careers for her sons. And within a couple of years, she'd arranged for William, that's the future General Howe, to be made a page of honor at court. And this was a paying position for teenage boys of genteel families, usually genteel families that had fallen on some hard times. And in the post, they were groomed for army life. They learned horsemanship and so on, as well as serving at court. And her oldest son, George, became an ensign in the prestigious Regiment of Foot Guards in 1745 at the age of 20. And now another of her sons, the future Admiral Howe, was obliged to start his career off at the age of 11 in the Merchant Marine. And that was a step that was unusual for an aristocratic family. This is a portrait that never was reproduced before until my book. It's privately owned by the Howe family. It's Richard looking extremely young. If any of you ever read about Admiral Howe, you always see him as a hardened old veteran. He was probably about age 30 when it was painted. The family tradition is that it was a wedding portrait. So he started off at age 11 in the Merchant Marine. Now this was considered to be ungentlemanly because officers in the Merchant Marines invested in their cargo. So it was considered to be going into trade. But it was difficult to get posts as midshipman in the Royal Navy, very competitive. He was age 14 when he finally entered the Royal Navy. With the start of the 7 Years' War in 1756, which of course is the French and Indian War here, Charlotte became the virtual head of the dynasty because all the Howe men were serving overseas. And she was in a very influential position. She was a friend of Lady Yarmouth, the king's mistress, who by this time George II was the king. And through her influence, her eldest son, George Augustus, was made a brigadier general in America. And this ushered in the second greatest tragedy of her life. This is George in his guards regimentals and powdered hair. In 1758, George was killed at Ticonderoga. He had gone to America specifically with a remit to adopt American-style wilderness fighting into the British Army. And he went out ranging with the famous Rogers Rangers, who really liked him, and he introduced light techniques into his own regiment. And he insisted that the officer class do without luxuries, that they do without excessive baggage. They had to discard their gold braid and lace and cut their hair, which some of the officers objected about, but George was very strict. And his egalitarian manner made him very popular with the colonial troops. In fact, I don't know how fair this is, but a 20th century historian writing after World War II claimed that George Howe was the most popular American officer ever to serve alongside American troops. And after he died, Massachusetts raised a monument to him in Westminster Abbey, the colony of Massachusetts. His mother, Charlotte, didn't have long to grieve, because no sooner did the news of George's death reach England when she was obliged to take action to protect his parliamentary seat. He represented Nottingham. But when the seat was known to be emptied by his death, a predatory political manager named the Duke of Newcastle decided to install one of his local favorites, with only Charlotte there to protect the family interests. And Charlotte prevented this by doing something that was very out of character for a woman of her rank. She appealed over the head of the Duke to the voters of Nottingham to give the seat to her younger son, William, and it worked. And she used dramatic language that carefully positioned her as a vulnerable female. She wrote, "Permit me to implore the protection of every one of you as the mother of him whose life has been lost in the service of his country." So, of course, the Duke threw up his hands, and William, who was the future General Howe, became the MP. And this was such an unusual thing for a woman of that time to do that it was reprinted in newspapers for years afterwards. And it shows Charlotte's skill, because Georgian women did get involved in politics, but they were supposed to stay strictly behind the scenes. And if they stepped too far into the public eye, could be heaped with criticism and even abuse. But for this episode, Charlotte was held up as the prototype of a stoical British mother of a military family and a grieving matriarch. Okay, now I want to talk about Caroline Howe. This is the only portrait remaining of her. You can see the Times in front of her. It was painted in 1812. The Times was a new newspaper then, the London Times. And she's sitting in her study, characteristically holding her pen. She was a famous letter writer, and it's her letters that are at the center of my book that are in the British Library now. She was the older sister to Admiral and General Howe and to George, who died at Ticonderoga. And she had been tutored by her mother to manage the careers of the Howe men, and she used connections at court and drawing room influence to pull strings for them. Now, just to show the bias of the day, Caroline was described as having a mind like a man. She was very clever, and she liked math, which was something a little unusual in ladies, Ben Franklin said when he met her. She was self-educated. She understood Latin, French, Greek. She read widely. She read anything, travel, literature, novels, the classics. But she was also athletic for the day she lived in. She was the only woman listed as a member of the Beaver Hunt from Rutland Castle in the 18th century, the single woman listed. And that's probably not because she loved blood sports, but because riding was an acceptable form of exercise for ladies in those days. Now, by the start of the Revolution, she was in her early 50s, and she was a widow. She'd married a man with the same last name who was no relative, so she kept her name of Caroline Howe. She lived in a townhouse in Grafton Street, a stylish townhouse that was 2 doors down from Admiral Howe. And it was to this house that she'd invite Benjamin Franklin to play a game of chess that would ultimately involve her brothers in the American War of Independence. The Franklin playing chess with Caroline Howe was a popular motif for 19th century artists. So this one's at Yale. The other is from a book, and I actually haven't been able to discover the artist. Now, Franklin, at this point, Franklin had been in London for over 10 years as a representative of a spokesman for the colonies. And in November 1774, 6 months before Lexington had conquered, Caroline sent a challenge to Franklin through a friend of hers who was a member of the Royal Society. And she said she heard he was a skilled chess player and she fancied she could beat him. She was very competitive, and she did play chess for money too. So what ensued was that Franklin came regularly to her house at number 12 Grafton Street. And he thought it was all innocent fun. He liked her very much. It was definitely a charm offensive. But what he discovered finally was that she was actually constructing a cover, because she was acclimatizing her neighbors in gossipy Georgian London to the sight of the easily recognizable American, who at this point was notorious for stirring up trouble in the colonies, coming to her home so that people would quit looking and quit paying attention. And on Christmas Day, she suddenly asked Franklin, did he want to meet Admiral Howe? And the upshot was that secret talks took place between Benjamin Franklin and Admiral Howe. And at this point, Admiral Howe was working for Lord Dartmouth. And Dartmouth was the only member of the British government at this stage who was trying to find a peaceful solution to the American crisis. The others were increasingly moving towards relying upon arms alone. And Howe asked Franklin for proposals that might satisfy the American leaders. The belief was that Franklin had his pulse on the Congress and knew what they might accept. Now, we know that this came to nothing, but Caroline was in on all the meetings. And I've discovered through her letters that she was the original link between the Howes and Dartmouth. The Howe brothers didn't know Dartmouth, and historians have wondered how the connection occurred. Caroline knew his wife through charitable work. And in October 1774, just days before she challenged Franklin to chess, Caroline was in the home of Lord Dartmouth, visiting Lady Dartmouth, who had a sick baby. And they discussed Dartmouth's ideas. Now, what Dartmouth wanted to do at this point was have a joint military diplomatic mission. The government had already determined to send British reinforcements to the armies in America, at Boston and probably New York. But Dartmouth wanted it to be accompanied by a spokesman who'd be empowered to speak with American leaders. And the idea was to stop the slide to war. And the Howes were obvious candidates because General William Howe had experience of American warfare, and the Howe family were popular in America because of George Lord Howe. And for their part, the Howes did not want to feel that their brother had died in vain. They felt they had an investment in the future of the colonies. So it was Caroline who drew her brother Richard into these secret talks, and probably thereby through her drew both the brothers into the War of Independence. Now, as we know, these talks were unsuccessful, and Franklin returned to America in March 1775 to join the Second Continental Congress. But the secret talks in London would eventually become part of the legend of the Howes, because rumors that they'd taken place began to spread during the war. And loyalists who were angry at the failure to end the rebellion claimed that Admiral Howe had been manipulated by Ben Franklin in these meetings. And I'll talk more about that in due course. And this leads me to the only non-Howe I've included in my album, Elizabeth Loring. Now, Admiral Howe arrived in America in 1776, and by then the brothers were joint commanders at that point of British forces. And it was by early 1777 that it was becoming clear that the war in America was stalling for the British. They'd taken New York City, of course, and then, as you'll all know, Washington struck back just after Christmas and early New Year, putting the British on the defensive for the rest of the winter. And it was news of this that caused British public opinion to start attacking the brothers. And now the conspiracy theories I've mentioned gained traction very quickly. The Howe brothers were accused of deliberately losing a war that had been sold by the government as being impossible to fail. And motives for their supposed perfidy varied. One was that they secretly supported the rebels because they'd raised a monument to George Howe. Another was that they wanted to prolong the war to make money. And another, the one that's persisted in the history books is that they hoped to gain glory as the saviors of the empire. And they thought that by being soft on the American soldiers, that would bring the American leaders to the bargaining table, that would be the best way to do it. And this was the idea that was associated with the accusation that Franklin had manipulated Admiral Howe. I don't have a picture of Elizabeth Loring. There used to be one. It's completely disappeared. This is a cartoon that came out in London to give you an idea of the attack on the Howes there in October 1777. And you can see the admiral and the general seated at a table talking about how to prolong the war, how to get rich, and the devil saying, how prolong the war. But most of the blame was put on General Howe and immediate attacks on him. He was converted from a dashing hero, the dashing hero who'd helped capture Quebec in the 7 Years' War in 1759, to a decadent aristocrat. And the central figure in the media-based destruction of his image was Elizabeth Loring. Now, Elizabeth Loring was a Boston woman who Howe had met in 1775, and she and her husband Joshua were both loyalists, and they'd taken refuge in Boston after the Battle of Lexington and conquered. And when General Howe evacuated Boston and went to Halifax and then New York, the Lorings went with him. And at New York, Joshua was made commissary of prisoners by General Howe. It was in early 1777 when, these attacks on the house started up, that rumors began that Betsy Loring was William Howe's mistress, and that her husband stood by and allowed the affair in return for his job as commissary. And this accusation started with private letters by New York loyalists who were angry at Howe. They were writing home about it. But the rebel newspapers, of course, were quick to pick it up. They were happy to make these sort of accusations too. And so was the London press. So the Howes got it from both sides. Because, of course, in London, people were furious at the fact that the war was going badly. And as loyalist refugees came into London, they joined in the attacks. The Howes had been popular in both Britain and America after the 7 Years' War, but now they were made over to be middle-aged, bloated aristocrats who lacked what it took to win Britain's wars, and especially William. And the image that was widespread of him was of him in bed with Mrs. Loring, the idea of indolence. And she was made out to be Delilah to his Samson. And you may have heard the rhyme written by Francis Hopkinson: Sir William, he, snug as a flea, lay all this time a-snoring in bed with Mrs. Loring. So that's just an example of the kind of thing that was going around. Now, historians have barely looked into the facts of Mrs. Loring's life, while constantly mentioning her, even if just briefly, as Howe's mistress. And it's always been assumed that all the gossip was true, despite the lack of immediate proof. But by looking at her through the lens of the Howe family, I've found that it's highly unlikely that she was his mistress. Elizabeth Loring was born in 1752. She was more than 20 years younger than William. She was born to the Lloyds, who were a well-to-do Long Island family. And by the time she met William in May 1775, she was married to Joshua Loring, who was from a Boston family. And just as the gossip goes, William surely did meet her as soon as he arrived in Boston, but not because of her supposed flashing blue eyes and blonde hair. That's how she's always described, although there's no picture to prove it. Her husband, Joshua, had served in the French and Indian War alongside William Howe at Havana in Cuba in 1762. And her uncle, James Lloyd, was a doctor who William believed had saved his life in 1758. After the siege of Louisburg, the British Army went to Boston, and this was in 1758, and William fell extremely ill, and he believed that it was Dr. Lloyd's care that had saved him. So William already knew Elizabeth Loring's family. And the other fact that's been overlooked by historians is that when Elizabeth met William, she was 4 months pregnant, which is not an auspicious time to begin an affair. And that's a fact that military historians haven't bothered to look up, even though her son is in the Dictionary of National Biography. So all they have to do is look at his birth date and count backwards. Her baby was born in October 1775 and was named after the last royal governor of New Hampshire, John Wentworth. And the reason that matters is because John Wentworth had been her husband's employer before the war. And so they named the baby for this employer. And the Wentworths were related to the family of Frances Howe. She was General Howe's wife. When Governor Wentworth and his wife refugeed to London, they associated with Frances Howe. So it's simply unbelievable that William would choose as a mistress a woman whose friends and family were part of his own circle, who knew his wife, and in a day when rank mattered, who came from a respectable middle-class background. What William and Mrs. Loring thought of having their names tied together forever isn't known. She didn't leave any letters, and William Howe said nothing. But the episode does show an unpleasant misogynistic streak in the attempts to blacken the Howe name. And it's been by reconstructing his private world that I've been able to find out more about who Mrs. Loring really was. That was the lens by which I widened the picture of her. And also by going through the letters of the Howe women and women who were associated with them during the war, I know that the Howe women didn't believe the Loring rumor. But what they did mind very much was the attacks on General Howe by the British press, and the fact that, curiously, George Washington was lionized in the British press. So in concluding, before I turn over to Jim Ambuske, and I did want to show, William, I thought I should include a portrait of him as I've been talking about him. There are no actual verified portraits of him taken from life. This is the one that you usually see in the biographies. But I just want to say in conclusion that too often male historical figures are written about entirely removed from their personal lives. No major female historical figure is ever studied in this way by compartmentalizing her professional life and treating her personal and family life as almost irrelevant or just a footnote. And through my book, I've shown that too much is missed or misunderstood when historians shun private papers and treat their subjects, usually men, as entirely public figures. Okay.
Great. That should be raised the screen, please. Now the awkward moment where we wait for this thing to go all the way up. Julie, please.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was terrific. This is actually my second crack at you, which I'm very fortunate for. As you reminded me, you know, we talked on a virtual setting last year, but then just before we got on stage, you mentioned that this is your first in-person talk.
That's right. Thanks to COVID. Yeah.
Well, we're very delighted to have you here and actually to present this marvelous book at Mount Vernon. I want to actually begin kind of where you left off, and we'll talk for a few minutes, and then we want to hear from our friends in the audience. But you were talking about the fact that we often compartmentalize the personal and private lives of military figures and men in particular, and we treat women differently. Take us back to that moment of discovery when you were contemplating writing that sequel to When London Was Capital of America, and you found those papers. What was that moment like, and what did you begin to see as you began to just read through them, and what came to your mind as you imagined what could be?
Well, the first thing was that historians are quite emphatic writing about either Admiral Howe or General Howe that what they did ashore, well, in the case of Admiral Howe, what he did ashore or whatever is almost a mystery, and nothing is known about their personal lives. But the letters Caroline wrote to her friends contain a wealth of detail about personal lives, what was going on in the Howe family, what people felt, what they thought. And although she didn't directly write about politics very often, although she followed the political scene very closely, from her letters, I've been able to reconstruct who the brothers knew, what important political figures they knew, even when they were seeing them. And so I started realizing the first layer was to say, oh, come on, it's impossible to find out anything about their personal lives. Well, here it all is. I mean, it's just one gossip sheet after another. She and Lady Spencer were close confidants. And the second was that I started realizing that upon closer inspection, there really was a lot to be deduced about the Howes and their political contacts from Caroline's letters. She also followed politics very closely. She was visited a lot by leading politicians of the time who liked playing cards with her. And whatever contacts the brothers had, she had as well. She assisted in working to get Admiral Howe named as peace commissioner, for example, during the War of Independence. And I can actually, at the beginning, at the outset of the war, and I can actually follow in her papers people she was visiting who were part of this decision and the times at which she visited them, even though in the letters she doesn't directly talk about what was going on. But it all matches up. And that was how I was able to match up the fact that she was the contact with Lord Dartmouth, because she was in his house just days before she issued the first invitation to Franklin.
The political machinations in engineering is quite remarkable to me. And you had mentioned this a little bit during your talk, that it was considered uncouth for one to operate in the political sphere. To what extent were they violating these so-called conventions and placing themselves in a position where they could receive potential criticism or disdain from their social equals or potentially their social betters?
Well, I think one thing that's interesting about the Howe women is that they were a family. It tended to run in families, women who had a family tradition of, working parlor politics, you can call it. Um, and the Howe women were very canny at it. And I think there's a saying, well-behaved women seldom make history. Well, I don't think the Howe women would have given a hoot. As far as they were concerned, they were there to further the dynastic fortunes, and they did it, and they did it very well. And I think Caroline was very happy with her position in society. A lot of important men called upon her and respected her opinion, but she didn't go public. There was a view that women were supposed to be there on behalf of their family, and they simply weren't supposed to expose themselves too much to the public when they were. They mustn't look self-interested. It was considered unfeminine. So you may know the story of the Duchess of Devonshire, who openly campaigned in the early 1780s for Charles James Fox. And she was talked into going and kissing all sorts of voters in the streets and so on and so forth. And for that, she was absolutely hounded in the press because it was a public show, and she was stepping beyond the bounds. But as long as people were discreet, and I think Caroline's an interesting person because she's an example of a Georgian woman who played this game very successfully. But in one respect, though, she did care about women's position in society. She had very strong attitudes about scandal and friends of hers who were involved in scandal. She was supportive of women who left their husband because they were absolutely unlivable. But the way she supported them was by spreading the story that they'd gone away for their health or something. But she was always very supportive. And in one case, so she thought women should be treated well in marriage. And in one case, she actually appeared in court on behalf of a woman whose husband wanted to divorce her. So he trumped up a story of her having an affair. And Caroline and other people showed up and contradicted it all, and it was all dropped. So in her own terms, she believed that women should be influential and matter.
I want to remind our folks here at the audience that we'll have an opportunity for questions in a moment. We'll pass the mic, and then those of you watching from home, please do pop your questions in the chat if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, and they'll be fed to me here, and we'll have a good conversation with you involved. You just brought up the press, and one of the things that really struck me, both in the presentation and also your book, of course, is that the Howe brothers just get lambasted in the press. But then, as you mentioned, Washington gets lionized.
That's right.
How does that happen?
Yeah.
That's not supposed to really be the way you think it would go.
No, that's right. That's right. Washington was very popular. And I think that, when I think of the War of Independence, in some ways it was the most atypical war for Britain of the whole century. Most of the wars Britain got involved in, the first few years they did very badly. So at the start of the 7 Years' War, they lost at Rochefort, Hastembeck. There was Fort William Henry and other disasters in America. And in Britain, there'd always be this loud outcry, and then the British would pull themselves together and come back, fighting mad and defeat the enemy. And the British, although of course you couldn't exactly say they liked that, but they also regarded it as the mark of a free people. Because unlike tyrannical France, they didn't keep a huge expensive standing army all the time. Instead, they weren't really prepared for war, but as free people, when war happened, they pulled themselves together. The War of Independence was a completely different narrative. The British expected it to be easy, and in some ways, they were not comfortable with that because all of a sudden, they were Goliath and the Americans were David. And I think that I think that some of the admiration of George Washington comes from that. He was actually held up as a kind of a type of an Anglo-American soldier, an antique hero who had English values. He fought alongside his men. He endured hardships, and he didn't ask to be paid. That impressed people very much, whereas the Howes were false. They were paid, but they were falsely accused of trying to make a fortune off the war. So in the end, it was the Howes who were heaped with abuse because they should have been able to win this war, and instead, as old roués or whatever they were meant to be, they'd failed, and Washington was held up. What's interesting is that the Americans also wrote newspaper pieces where they pictured General Wolfe, who'd won Quebec and died in 1759, and George Lord Howe, the very popular George Lord Howe, as coming back as ghosts or whatever, and saying, if I'd still been alive, I would have been on the American side. So the Howe brothers were depicted as having become debauched middle-aged Howes who were now absolutely awful, and this kind of attitude was even in the private circles of the Howes. I found an account a woman wrote of being at a tea table with a duchess and another woman who was actually a good friend of the Howes, even a friend of William's. And the women were talking over the table saying, I adore General Washington. And the woman who was writing this down was really annoyed because she was very much opposed to the American War. But I think, so the Howes must have heard in their own circles some of these attitudes. And of course, the Duchess of Devonshire, the daughter of Caroline's best friend, Lady Spencer, some of you may have heard this. She used to wear blue and buff to show her support for Washington, which probably, I know it irritated her mother. I never found out what Caroline thought about it.
Well, last question from me before we turn to the audience. Speaking of the Howes and Washington, what was their relationship like? They had a few engagements, you might say, in the summer of 1776 in New York, and it didn't go so well for George Washington there for a while until a quick victory that winter. But what was their dynamic like as you had two commanders-in-chief of the British Army and the Royal Navy versus I guess they would say, a pretended commander-in-chief of a rebel army? What was their dynamic?
Well, Washington, Howe was aware after Bunker Hill that George Washington, of course he wasn't at Bunker Hill, but he drew a lot of lessons from it. And what he wanted to do was maneuver the British into marching into rebel fire again with the Americans. Actually, William wrote about this, with the Americans safe behind ramparts and nothing at their backs so they could run away. And William said, he said if he could just get them into a position like that and get them to feel safe so they'd be firing away at the British and they could go away around back. And it's true, at Brooklyn, Washington was hoping that he'd reprise Bunker Hill with the Americans barricaded in, firing at the British. And Howe pretended to play that for him while sending his army around back to cut off the Americans. And in fact, Washington was so sure of himself that initially he was bringing troops over from from Manhattan to reinforce the fort in Brooklyn. And then he suddenly realized that within one day, because the British had adopted a siege approach instead, they were going to be able to, their fire was going to be able to hit the Americans. And furthermore, the British Navy could come up the East River. And that was when he, did his famous evacuation over to Manhattan. And I think it only succeeded because there was a storm. So he did it under cover of a storm. And I think, but basically, I think that, they've been compared a lot. I don't know if people have found that in their reading. Washington and Howe have often been compared because they had these similarities. They were similar in height, similar in age. They were supposed to both be completely fearless under fire. And historians have also said neither was ever wounded. But in fact, I found out William was wounded in the 7 Years' War at one point. And they also were alike in other ways that aren't usually pointed out. They both had never been commanders-in-chief at the start of the war. And they both privately expressed some trepidation at the prospect of this. And William wrote, when he was informed he was going to become commander-in-chief in Boston, he wrote to his brother and said, I think this may be a bit much. It was partly because he was aware the American war could stall. And that letter's gone, but Richard, rewrote it to sound different and wrote to Lord Germain about this. But I think both of them, at the outset wondered if it was something they were untried generals, as it was put.
Well, that's enough for me. Thank you very much for indulging me. Do we have any audience questions? Folks out here would like to ask a question? Yes, sir.
Thank you. It's on? Okay, thank you. Was there another generation of Howes? This is kind of, you call it a dynasty, but were there more Howes later on?
Oh, well, there were no more famous military figures, but that's an interesting question because there were 8. The family actually did pretty well. Scrope Howe and Charlotte Howe actually had 10 children, and only 2 died young, which in those days was extremely good going. And 8 of them grew to adulthood. But strangely, most of them never had any children. That was more common in those days than you think. And only Admiral Howe had children. He had 3 daughters. And at one point, just at the end of the War of Independence, George III gave him a British title of Viscount Howe with a baronetcy that could be passed on to a female member of the family if he died without sons. And it was her son, Baroness Howe, after Richard died, who they then convinced George IV to make him an earl. That's why there's still an Earl Howe. There's actually a break between, because Admiral Howe eventually became an earl. There's a break between his title and the one that exists now, which still exists to this day. But it is peculiar that there were only the 2 girls, the 2 daughters of the admiral, who had children, and they each only had 1 surviving son. It's kind of a lesson in how very, very difficult it was in those days with all the primitive medicine to keep family lines going.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We have a question coming in from Tom McAndrew over online. Was Caroline Howe involved in preparing General Howe's defense of his actions in America for his appearance before Parliament?
Okay, I don't think so. I never saw any evidence for that. He was assisted by Major Balfour, who was a faithful, by then he was a colonel, who had been his faithful aide de camp. And I think probably members of the opposition advised him because he was very close with them by then. But I never heard that Caroline was actually directly involved in the construction of his defense.
Thank you very much, Tom. Another question from the in-person audience? Yeah, down here in front.
First, I was I really enjoyed the book. You mentioned Caroline as a very sort of avid gambler, playing aggressively for a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I guess my question was, talking about how the Howe family finances had sort of depreciated at the start. How much money is actually changing hands at these games? Are they sort of running up tabs against each other, or are they really sort of gambling away all these sums seemingly all the time?
Well, that's an interesting question because in the generation after Lady Spencer and Caroline, which included the Duchess of Devonshire and Charles James Fox, people started gambling for spectacular sums of money. And I've seen letters of Caroline saying, "Can you credit it? He lost £4,000 in one night," and this kind of thing, which is just an eye-watering sum in those days. Caroline sometimes she would bemoan losing 60 or 70 pounds on a bad night and say, "Poor bank is empty." But she was careful. She wasn't, she was sensible. She enjoyed gambling, but she made sure that she didn't lose huge sums of money. Lady Spencer was actually a compulsive gambler, strangely enough. She was a very charitable woman who did all sorts of good for the poor, but she would gamble away large sums of money and wail about it to Caroline, who tried to tell her how to control her habit. But she was compulsive. Caroline was a very shrewd gambler, and she won a lot. And I've seen letters of other ladies who played with her, who complained that she would insist on raising the stakes. Let's gamble for higher and higher stakes. I think she liked excitement. A lot of aristocratic women used gambling as an outlet if they wanted, a bit of risk in their lives. And I think she was an example of that, but not foolishly.
Thank you very much. Susan Sonamaker online is asking, did the Howe family have an opinion as to why Britain lost the war?
It's probably something they didn't like to be asked at parties. I think that if they had to give a single reason, it would be General Burgoyne. I think, that sounds very partisan, but the one thing I took out of my book, which I've never read in any military history, is that the idea that Burgoyne's army could have just gone from Canada to Boston by sea was around at that time. He really didn't have to push his way through the American wilderness to join Howe at New York. He could have just gone by sea. But he saw Germain in London before the expedition started, and he had permission to try to break through and take Ticonderoga, which of course Carlisle had failed on the year before, and Burgoyne kept saying, I can do it, I can do it. But by that time, taking those backwoods forts wasn't as important anymore, because the object of the war was no longer to isolate New England, which it had been at the start of the war. And so, the British were very good at amphibious operations. The Royal Navy was something they had that the Americans couldn't even come close to. And it would have made absolute sense to just bring Burgoyne's army to join Williams at New York. And of course, Burgoyne didn't want to do that, because he would then be under Howe and the army would be placed under Howe's command. And he wanted an independent command. And Germain had the view that Howe was too soft and not trying hard enough, and Burgoyne would get out there and get the job done. And boy, he did. And so I think that if they had to, in fact, Howe put that into his speech before Parliament, his self-exculpatory speech, and then scored it out, I think for political reasons, because he didn't want to be seen to be attacking Burgoyne. He said, couldn't he have just come by sea? And then Saratoga would never have happened. And so I would say, yeah, I think the Howes were in favor of focusing more on amphibious operations and taking some of the large seaports and using the big advantage the British had, which was the Navy, and it wasn't getting bogged down in the backwoods and being picked off by American soldiers.
Yeah. Other questions from here in the audience? Yes, sir. Down in front here.
A lot of historians have certainly said that the failure of Burgoyne was certainly Burgoyne's, but that Howe decided to go to Philadelphia instead of going up the Hudson River and at least threatening. He did send Clinton up, but it was a little late when that finally happened. You implied that there was never an agreement. But on the other hand, O'Shaughnessy in The Men Who Lost America very clearly states that orders from London had indicated that at least the prime minister and the king expected Howe to go up the Hudson River and at least threaten the armies of Arnold and Gates before they contested with Burgoyne. How do you see that?
Well, I'm not aware of any direct orders Howe ever had to actively go up the Hudson and assist Burgoyne. Clinton did that after he got messages from Burgoyne saying, I'm in a lot of trouble. Clinton was worried. He came back from London before Howe departed from New York for Philadelphia. And he did say, maybe we should just go up the Hudson first. But he knew that Howe had complete approval to go to Philadelphia. He did know that. It had been approved in London. What he was afraid of was that Washington would attack New York instead. So Clinton wasn't about to go scooting up the Hudson until he got word from Burgoyne that he was in trouble. Burgoyne, when Howe started getting a rumor that Burgoyne had been defeated at Saratoga, he didn't believe it at first, because Burgoyne could have just retreated back to Ticonderoga. He really didn't have to cross the Hudson. But he'd made such a thing out of, I'm not going to be like Carlisle. I'm not going to, go back, and I'm going to take all these forts, and I'm going to, get to the top of the Hudson. But I'm not Howe definitely did not have orders to go up and help. I have to say, I think the whole campaign was a shambles. I mean, why Howe was told to go ahead to Philadelphia and Burgoyne was told to proceed overland. But I think that a lot of the blame for that, I'm afraid, is in London. There wasn't a clear, overarching idea of what the point of those two of the whole campaign was. And sorry, not to get into too much detail, but Germain had worked closely with William Pitt in the 7 Years' War. And all of the American expeditions that Pitt planned, they had these different prongs, like going up the Hudson and coming down and so on and so forth and attacking forts. Every one of them was designed to complement each other, but they could also stand alone. If one failed, the other ones wouldn't be endangered. Okay, and I think that the other thing that Pitt did was he picked generals who were very, very ambitious. And I think that Germain had this idea that Howe was too fuddy-duddy. He was thinking of his old mentor Pitt. He'd pick Burgoyne because he was, this really gung-ho type. But he didn't follow the one Pitt's rule, which was make sure that every campaign can stand on its own, and if it fails, it's not going to be a complete disaster. In the end, I don't think Burgoyne was totally clear what his objective was supposed to be, except that he was determined to get across the Hudson. I hope that answers your question, but I'm not aware. Howe certainly was not ordered to go up and help Burgoyne first. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it. Julie, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you again. This has been a terrific, we could talk for 6 more hours actually about this book, and I hope you have a chance to ask her some questions after. We are selling some copies of Julie's wonderful book in the anteroom or the outer room out there, and I believe that you'll be available for signing. But thank you very much again. Please join me in thanking Julie Flavell.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.